The emergency lights flashed red across the Galactic Council station as Ambassador Veltara rushed through the corridors. Her 3 eyes darted between the holographic displays showing world after world going dark. The void swarm was spreading, faster than anyone had predicted. "How many colonies have we lost?" she asked Captain Juan, her voice shaking. 17 in the last week, Juan replied, his mandibles clicking nervously. "They're not just attacking, they're consuming everything. Plants, animals, even the rocks and metals." Veltara stopped in front of the main tactical display. Red dots marked the fallen worlds, and more were blinking yellow as distress signals poured in. The crystalline creatures of the void swarm moved, like a plague across the galaxy, leaving nothing but empty space behind them. "What about the defense fleets?" she demanded. "Gone. The swarm doesn't fight like anything we've seen before. They overwhelm our ships with sheer numbers, then tear them apart with their crystal claws. Our weapons barely scratch them." A new alarm started wailing. Another world had fallen silent. Veltara's scaled hands trembled as she accessed the emergency protocols. The Council had contingency plans for invasions, rebellions, even civil wars. But nothing like this. The Void Swarm wasn't trying to conquer territory or steal resources. They were simply erasing everything in their path. "We need help," she whispered. "Send messages to all our allies. Every species, every fleet." "Ma'am, we already did," Juan said softly. "The Corellian Empire is retreating to their core worlds. The Zephyrian Federation has gone into isolation. Even the warrior clans of Thaxon refuse to engage the swarm." Veltara felt her heart sink. If the Thaxons, the most aggressive species in the galaxy, were afraid to fight, what hope did they have? "There must be someone," she said desperately. "Check the database again. Every species, no matter how small or weak." Juan's fingers danced. Across the control panel, names and faces flashed across the screen, species after species marked as unavailable or declined assistance. Then something caught his attention. "Wait," he said, pointing at a small entry near the bottom of the D list. "What about the humans?" Veltara's eyes narrowed. "Humans? I've never heard of them. They're from a system called Sol, third planet from their star. They only joined the galactic community 50 years ago." 50 years? Veltara's voice rose. "They're practically primitives. What could they possibly do against the Void Swarm?" Juan pulled up their file. Information was sparse. A young species, relatively small population, limited space travel. But something in their military history made him pause. "Ma'am, look. At this, they list something called total war as their primary military doctrine." Total war. Veltara had never heard the term. Most civilized species fought with honor codes and rules of engagement. What does that mean? "I don't know, but it says here they've never lost a war when they committed to it fully." Veltara stared at the screen. The humans were their last option. Every other species had either fled or been destroyed. She had to try something. "Set course for the Sol system," she ordered. "Maximum speed." "Ma'am, are you sure?" "They're so far from the front lines. By the time we reach them and return, the swarm could what? Destroy more worlds?" "They're already doing that." Veltara's voice hardened. "We're out of options, Captain. Send the message." 3 days later, their ship approached Earth's orbital defense platform. Veltara expected to find a simple space station with basic life support. Instead, she stared through the viewport at massive structures that defied her understanding of human technology. "Those aren't in their official records," Juan whispered, pointing at enormous shipyards hidden in asteroid fields. "How did they build all this?" Veltara didn't answer. She was too busy counting the weapon emplacements that tracked their ships. Approach. For a primitive species, the humans seemed very well armed. The docking bay was larger than most Council military bases. As they walked through the corridors, Veltara noticed something else strange. The walls were covered with images of human soldiers in various conflicts. The faces were young, but their eyes looked old. Admiral Park met them in the command center. He was a stocky man with graying hair and scars on his hands. His uniform was simple compared to council military dress, but something about his bearing made Veltara's skin crawl. "Ambassador," he said politely, "I understand you have a problem." Veltora explained the situation quickly. The Void Swarm, the fallen worlds, the desperate need for reinforcements. "We need help," she finished. "Perhaps 200 or 300 soldiers to assist with evacuations." Park's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Ma'am, we don't do 200 or 300 when our friends are in trouble. I'm sorry." Park turned to his aide. "Lieutenant Kim, activate the reserve fleets. Tell them to prep the shock troopers." Latara's translator struggled with the unfamiliar term, shock troopers. "You'll see," Park replied, his smile cold as space itself. While the council spent precious hours debating supply chains and evacuation routes, something else was happening in the dark corners of the Sol system. Deep in the asteroid belt, structures that had been labeled as mining operations suddenly came alive with activity. Massive doors opened in what looked like ordinary rocks, revealing shipyards that dwarfed anything the council had ever built. Admiral Park stood in the command center, watching the displays as hundreds of ships began launching. These weren't the sleek, elegant vessels of council design. They were brutal, angular things that looked like they had been built for one purpose: war. "Sir, the 9th Shock Battalion is ready for deployment," reported Lieutenant Kim, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were unleashing. "Good. What about the others?" "The 15th, 23rd, and 47th Battalions are loading now. The 7th is requesting permission to bring their heavy equipment." Park nodded. "Granted. We're doing this. We're doing it right." On the transport ship Indomitable, Colonel Lee addressed her troops. The hangar bay was packed with soldiers who looked nothing like the polished military forces of the Council. Their armor was scarred and patched, their weapons worn from use. These were veterans of conflicts the galaxy had never heard of. "Listen up, troopers." Lee's voice carried across the massive space. "The bugs think they can eat our new friends. Time to show them what happens when they mess with humanity's allies." Soldiers checked their equipment with practiced efficiency. Their gear looked crude compared to Council technology, but it had been tested in ways that would horrify civilized species. Every weapon, every tool, every piece of armor had been designed for one thing: killing enemies and keeping humans alive. Sergeant Cho sat with his squad, reviewing the tactical data they had received about the Void Swarm. The information was sparse, but it was enough to start planning. "They're crystalline," he said, pointing at the holographic display. "That means they're brittle. Hit them hard enough and they'll shatter." "What about their numbers?" asked Private Han, cleaning his plasma rifle. "We'll deal with that when we get there. We always do." The Council military advisors aboard the transport ships grew increasingly uncomfortable. As they listened to the humans discuss their battle plans, these weren't the careful, measured strategies they were used to. The humans talked about acceptable losses, scorched earth tactics, and something they called total war. Captain Jen, the Council's military liaison, approached Colonel Lee during the journey. "Colonel, I'm concerned about your strategy. Reports suggest you're planning to engage the swarm directly." Lee looked up from her equipment check. "That's the idea, but that's suicide. The swarm has overwhelming numbers. Our doctrine is to evacuate civilians and establish defensive positions." "Your doctrine doesn't work," Lee replied bluntly. "That's why you're losing. But the casualties will be minimal. On our side." Chen's breathing apparatus wheezed with distress. "What about the Geneva Conventions? Rules of warfare?" Lee's expression hardened. "Those rules apply to humans fighting humans? These aren't humans." The alien observer stepped back, suddenly understanding that he was dealing with something beyond his comprehension. The humans weren't just soldiers. They were predators, preparing to hunt. In another part of the ship, Major Yoon briefed his engineering unit on the swarm's weaknesses. The Council had provided detailed scans of the crystalline creatures, but they had missed something important. "Look at these resonance patterns," Yoon said, highlighting sections of the data. Their crystal structure vibrates at specific frequencies. Hit them with the right harmonic, and they'll shatter like glass. His engineers nodded, already making notes. Within hours, every human weapon would be modified to exploit this weakness. "Sir," one of his lieutenants asked, "what if they adapt?" "The swarm is supposed to be intelligent. Then we adapt faster," Yoon replied. "That's what we do." The fleet consisted of over 200 ships, carrying 50,000 of humanity's most experienced soldiers. These weren't fresh recruits or planetary defense forces. They were veterans of the Titan Rebellion, the Outer Colony Wars and conflicts. That had never made it into official records. On the flagship Retribution, Admiral Park reviewed the final battle plans with his senior officers. The Council had asked for a few hundred soldiers to help with evacuations. Instead, they were getting an army, remember Park said. "We're not just fighting for the Council, we're fighting for every species that calls this galaxy home." The swarm doesn't negotiate, doesn't retreat, and doesn't show mercy.
Wrote.
We. The officers nodded grimly. They had all seen what happened when humanity's enemies mistook restraint for weakness. As the fleet approached the war zone, Council observers aboard the ships began to understand the true scope of what they had unleashed. The humans weren't sending reinforcements. They were sending an extermination force. "Sir," Captain June approached Admiral Park one final time. "I must ask, what exactly are shock troopers?" Park's smile was cold as vacuum. "They're what we use when we want something dead, and we want to make sure it stays that way." Reports from the front lines were coming in. The Void Swarm had consumed another world and was moving toward the Council's core systems. But now, for the first time since the invasion began, they were about to face something they had never encountered before. Humanity had come to war. The Void Swarm had consumed 17 worlds without meeting serious resistance. The crystalline forms moved through space like a living wave, breaking apart ships and devouring everything in their path. The hive mind that controlled them had processed thousands of different species, learned their tactics, and adapted accordingly, but they had never encountered humans. The first contact happened at Colony Theta 7, where 10,000 Council civilians waited for evacuation. The swarm had surrounded the planet, cutting off all escape routes. Council forces had retreated to defensive positions, following standard protocol while they waited for rescue ships that would never come. Then, the human fleet arrived. "Captain." Song watched from the bridge of the assault carrier Hammer as the swarm ships moved to intercept them. The crystalline vessels were beautiful in their way, geometric patterns that caught and reflected light like living jewels. They were also 3 times larger than his ship and outnumbered his fleet 10-1. "Sir, they're moving to surround." "Us," reported his tactical officer. "Good," Song replied. "Saves us the trouble of hunting them down." All ships begin the attack run. The Council observers on the bridge looked at each other in alarm. This wasn't how space combat was supposed to work. You established formations, tested enemy defenses, looked for weaknesses. The humans just charged straight into the swarm. The first salvo of human weapons hit the crystalline, ships like hammers, striking glass. The modified frequencies that Major Yoon's engineers had developed caused the alien hulls to vibrate and crack. But the swarm adapted quickly, reinforcing their structures and closing the gaps. "They're learning," observed the Council military advisor. "So are we," Song replied, watching as his weapons crews switched to different frequencies. Fire everything. On the planet's surface, the real battle was just beginning. The swarm had landed millions of creatures across the colony's major cities. They moved like living gems, their crystal claws slicing through buildings and vehicles. With ease. The few remaining Council defenders had taken shelter in fortified bunkers. Waiting for the end, then the drop pods started falling. Sergeant Cho felt his stomach drop as his pods screamed through the atmosphere. Around him, his squad checked their weapons one final time. They had done this before on a dozen different worlds, but never against anything like the Void Swarm. The pod hit the ground with a crash that would have killed most species. The humans inside barely noticed. "Move, move, move," shouted as the pod doors blew open. A squad poured out into a street filled with crystalline creatures the size of buildings. The swarm had never seen anything like what happened next, where Council forces retreated in orderly formations, the humans advanced. Where other species use ranged weapons and careful tactics, the humans closed to melee range with weapons that had no business being in a modern battlefield. Private. Han found himself face to face with a crystal creature twice his size. Of retreating, he pulled out a plasma cutter designed for industrial work and went to work on the thing's legs. "This is not standard military equipment," gasped a council observer who was watching the battle feeds. "Standard doesn't work on these things," replied Colonel Lee, calmly directing her troops while standing in the middle of a swarm nest. "Improvise, adapt, overcome." The swarm's hive mind tried to process what it was seeing. These new creatures didn't follow any recognizable pattern. They used mining equipment as weapons, turned construction tools into explosives. It seemed to view being outnumbered as an opportunity rather than a problem. Lieutenant Park led her platoon through the colony's main street, which was now crawling with crystal creatures. Her soldiers moved like they were walking through a park, casually destroying everything in their path. "Remember," she called out, "if it's not human, it dies. No exceptions." A massive swarm creature, bigger than a house, dropped from a building. Onto the street in front of them, crystal fangs were longer than a human arm, and its claws could slice through steel. Park looked at it for a moment, then pulled out a thermal detonator. "Iggly," she said, and threw the device into the creature's mouth. The explosion cleared a 50-meter radius. The surviving humans regrouped and kept moving forward. On the orbital command ship, Council Admiral Zithak watched the tactical displays with growing horror. The battle wasn't going according to any military doctrine he had ever studied. The humans weren't trying to win, they were trying to exterminate. "Sir," his aide whispered, "they're not taking prisoners. They're not even trying to capture territory. They're just killing everything." Below them, Corporal Nam's squad had found a swarm breeding facility. The crystalline larvae were harmless, not yet developed enough to fight. Standard military protocol would be to document their location and call for specialists. Teams to deal with them. Nam armed a fusion charge and set it for maximum yield. "No witnesses," he said simply. The swarm's hive mind felt something it had never experienced before: fear. These humans didn't fight like the other species. They fought like the swarm itself, with total commitment and no mercy. But the humans were worse. The swarm consumed worlds because it needed to survive. The humans were destroying the swarm because they wanted to. The tide of battle began to turn as more human forces landed on the planet. The creatures that had seemed invincible began to retreat for the first time in their existence. They had met their match. The Void Swarm's hive mind had processed the destruction of thousands of worlds. But it had never encountered tactical thinking like this. The humans didn't just fight. They hunted with a methodical brutality that turned the swarm's own strengths against them. Captain Song stood on the bridge of his ship, watching the planet below transform into a battlefield unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The crystalline creatures that had seemed unstoppable were now retreating from human positions, their perfect formations broken by tactics that made no sense to civilized minds. "Sir, the engineering teams have made another breakthrough," reported Lieutenant Kim, her voice excited despite the carnage around them. "They've figured out how to make the creature's own resonance frequencies tear them apart." Song nodded grimly. Within hours, every human weapon had been modified again. The creatures that had adapted to the first frequency attacks now faced something entirely new, their own bodies betraying them. On the planet's surface, Major Yoon's engineering unit had discovered something the Council's scientists had missed for months. The swarm's crystalline structures weren't just vulnerable to harmonic frequencies, they were actually amplifying them, spreading the destructive vibrations throughout their entire network. "It's like they're all connected," Yoon explained too. His team, pointing at the readings on his scanner, hit one hard enough, and the damage spreads to the others. His engineers looked at each other with the kind of smile that meant bad news for someone else. Within minutes, they had jury-rigged a massive sonic weapon from mining equipment and orbital communication arrays. "Sir," one of his lieutenants asked, "what if this affects the human forces too?" "Then we'll adapt," Yoon replied, already calculating. Blast patterns. That's what we do. The first test of the new weapon cleared an entire city block of swarm creatures. The crystalline beings simply shattered, their death screams echoing through the hive mind network and causing panic among creatures kilometers away. But the humans weren't done innovating, Sergeant. Cho's squad had been studying the swarm's behavior patterns, and they had noticed something important. The creatures were intelligent, but they followed predictable routines. They attacked in waves, regrouped at specific locations, and always tried to overwhelm enemies with numbers. "They're fighting like a computer program," Cho told his men. "Same tactics, same patterns. Time to show them what chaos looks like." Squad abandoned all conventional military doctrine. Instead of holding defensive positions, they moved constantly. Instead of engaging the swarm head-on, they hit supply lines and communication nodes. Instead of trying to kill every creature, they focused on disrupting the hive mind's ability to coordinate attacks. The swarm had never faced enemies that fought without a plan. Colonel Lee watched the tactical displays from her command post, noting how the battle was changing. The creatures that had overwhelmed every council defense were now struggling to deal with human unpredictability. "They're learning," she observed, watching a group of swarm creatures try to adapt to human tactics. But they're learning the wrong lessons. The swarm's hive mind was indeed learning, but it was learning to fight humans the way it had fought other species. It reinforced positions that humans had already abandoned, was prepared for attacks that never came, and tried to predict movements that followed no logical pattern. Meanwhile, the humans kept changing their approach. Private Han had discovered that the swarm creatures were afraid of fire, not the energy weapons that most species used, but actual chemical fire from primitive fuel sources. Within hours, every human unit had improvised flamethrowers made from industrial equipment. "Sir," a council observer asked Colonel Lee, "why are your soldiers using such primitive weapons?" "Because they work," Lee replied, watching her troops advance behind walls of flame. The swarm adapted to energy weapons and projectiles. Never expected us to go backwards. The tide turned completely when Captain Park's battalion discovered the swarm's central processing node, a massive crystalline structure that coordinated hive mind communications across the entire planet. "That's their brain," Park told her demolitions expert. "How much explosive do we need to take it out?" "All of it," came the reply. The explosion was visible from orbit. The crystalline structure didn't just break, it vaporized, taking with it the swarm's ability to coordinate attacks. Across the planet, millions of creatures suddenly found themselves cut off from the hive mind, acting on individual instinct instead of collective intelligence. The humans showed no mercy to confused, isolated enemies. On the orbital command ship, Council Admiral Zithak watched in stunned silence as the human forces systematically exterminated every swarm creature on the planet. This wasn't warfare as he understood it. This was pest control on a planetary scale. "Sir," his aide whispered, "they're not just defeating the swarm, they're erasing it." The swarm tried one final desperate attack, gathering every remaining creature for a massive assault on the human positions. It was the kind of overwhelming force that had broken Council defenses on 17 worlds. The humans were ready for it. Every weapon, every trap, every improvised explosive device activated at once. The final battle lasted less than an hour, and when it was over, there were no swarm creatures left alive on the planet. For the first time in their species' existence, the Void Swarm sent a retreat signal from their remaining fleet. They had met something they couldn't consume, couldn't adapt to, couldn't defeat. The humans ignored the signal and kept firing. The Void Swarm's retreat signal echoed across the galaxy for the first time in their species' existence. Had never known defeat, never encountered a force it couldn't eventually overwhelm. The signal was desperate, almost pleading a request for mercy from creatures that had never shown any. "Admiral." Park read the translation on his command screen and deleted it without response. Around him, his officers continued coordinating the final assault on the remaining swarm ships. "Sir, they're trying to surrender," reported Lieutenant Kim, her voice uncertain. "No, they're not," Park replied calmly. "They're regrouping." "The swarm doesn't surrender. It adapts and comes back stronger. We're making sure that doesn't happen. The human fleet moved through space like a pack of wolves, hunting down every remaining crystalline vessel.
Ow!
The swarm ships that had once seemed beautiful now looked fragile as human weapons tore them apart.
No.
There would be no survivors, no escape pods, no witnesses to carry word of humanity's methods to other potential enemies. On the planet below, cleanup operation was already underway. Major Yoon's engineering teams moved through the ruins of swarm nests, using industrial equipment to burn out every trace of crystalline growth. Nothing would be left that could regenerate or spread. "Sir," one of his engineers called out, "we found some kind of eggs in the deep caverns. They appear to be dormant." "Not anymore," Yoon replied, priming a fusion charge. "Burn it all." The council observers watched in stunned silence as the humans methodically erased every trace of the swarm's presence. This wasn't just victory. It was complete annihilation. 3 days later, Admiral Park stood in the council's emergency session chamber. His dress uniform was spotless, his medals gleaming, his expression as calm as if he was reporting routine patrol results. The assembled representatives of dozens of species stared at him with expressions ranging from gratitude to horror. "Threat has been neutralized," he reported in the same tone he might use to order lunch. "All swarm forces have been eliminated. Civilian casualties were minimal. Infrastructure damage was extensive." Ambassador Veltera's 3 eyes struggled to focus on him. Her hands shook as she accessed the battle reports. Entire continents had been scorched clean. Cities had been reduced to glass. The swarm was gone, but so was everything they had touched. "Admiral," she said carefully, "your forces didn't just repel the invasion. You've committed genocide." Park's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, you asked for reinforcements. We sent shock troopers. This is what they do." "But the surrender signal they were trying to communicate was tactical deception," Park interrupted. "The swarm doesn't surrender, Ambassador. It regroups, adapts, and comes back stronger. We've seen this pattern before. The only way to stop a hive mind species is to eliminate it completely." Council Representative Zithak leaned forward in his, "Cede, you've done this before." "Not to this scale," Park admitted. "But the principle remains the same. Half measures don't work against enemies like this. You either win completely, or you lose everything." The chamber fell silent. The representatives looked at each other with growing unease. They had been saved by creatures whose approach to warfare was so fundamentally different that it challenged everything they believed about civilization. "What happens now?" asked another representative. "What happens to species that oppose humanity?" Park's smile was colder than the vacuum of space. "That depends on whether there are enemies or just having a disagreement." In the weeks that followed, the human fleet prepared to return to Earth. The shock troopers loaded their equipment onto transports, their job complete. They had saved the galaxy from the void swarm, but they had also shown the galaxy what humanity was capable of when pushed to action. Colonel Lee stood in the docking bay. Watching her troops prepare for departure, a young council delegate approached. Her nervously, his translator struggling with the concept he was trying to express. "Colonel," he said hesitantly, "may I ask why your species fights so intensely?" Lee paused in her equipment check. "Because when something threatens our friends, we don't just want to win. We want to make sure it never threatens anyone again." The delegate's breathing apparatus wheezed with anxiety. And if someone threatened humanity directly, Lee's expression became perfectly calm, which somehow made her words more terrifying. "Then you'd see what we're really capable of." The delegate stepped back, suddenly understanding that he had just glimpsed something beyond his comprehension. The humans hadn't shown their full strength against the swarm. They had shown restraint. As the human fleet departed, the council chamber reconvened in emergency session. Representatives sat in stunned silence, processing what they had witnessed. The void swarm was gone, but in its place was the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy lived a species that viewed total warfare as a routine military operation. "What do we do now?" asked Ambassador Veltera. "We make sure we stay on there good." Side replied Admiral Zitha letters K. The rescue mission was over. The galaxy was safe. But the council species would never sleep quite as peacefully again. Knowing that their salvation had come from creatures who made the void swarm look civilized by comparison, the humans had saved them all. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing of all. In the darkness of space, the human fleet disappeared into the void, carrying with them the secret of what happened when someone made the mistake of threatening humanity's friends. The galaxy would not forget.